So this is my last lecture in the law program. It's going to be on different odds and ends related to trade policy, maybe the political economy of trade policy. So I'm going to talk about three things. The first one is going to be the median voter theorem and collective action. Those two are kind of rolled together. And then I'm going to talk about trade wars. And then finally, I'm going to talk about trade creation versus trade diversion, right? So let me switch to my screen. Adjust my camera too, so you can see the top of my head. All right, so as I mentioned, today we're going to talk about the three odds and ends under the heading political economy of trade. All right. So the first item, as I mentioned, it's going to be about median voter theorem, and also say collective action. Those are kind of the same item. Right, number two, that's going to be trade wars. Number three is going to be trade creation, trade diversion. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is this median voter theorem and collective action. So just to motivate it for a second, the idea is that we know already that opening up to trade or freer trade, subject to some caveats about the distribution of how the returns are distributed in the society, but generally, at least, opening up to trade is going to grow the pie. So it's going to be more efficient. You're going to be able to get more stuff. Maybe it might change who gets which stuff. It might change the cut of the pie. But generally, trade is going to allow us to get more stuff. Okay, so it's going to be more efficient to open up the trade generally. All right. So you might ask yourself, in a world where you have an incentive, an efficiency incentive to open up the trade, why do we see so many tariffs? All right. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of models of how policies are formed in countries, and then talk about how that relates to tariff creation and which one we think is the one we see more in the real world. Okay, so I'm going to start with the median voter theorem. Okay. So we'll call this median voter. It's hardly a theorem, I'll just call it median voter. Okay, so let's suppose we have a country that has two political parties, party one and party two. So we'll say two political parties. We'll say one is P1 and P2. Party one, party two. We don't know which one's left, right? Just two parties, all right? And suppose that these parties are running on an election and they're both trying to win the election, and they want to campaign on tariffs. That tends to be what people care about these days in this country. So let's say that people have different opinions about what the best tariff policy would be, and let's say that there's a uniform distribution of people. Uniform distribution of people across preferred tariff policies. Okay, so I'll draw it right here. So suppose that we can actually illustrate this by drawing a little rectangle like this. Okay, so let's say this is tariffs equal to 0, and let's say this is tariffs equal to 1, so 100% tariffs or something like that. And let's say that the height of this rectangle is 1. So this represents the people in the country, and there's this uniform distribution. The same number of people want tariffs equal to 0 as want tariffs equal to 1/2 as want tariffs equal to 1. All right. So this models opinions of people in the country. Okay. Now let's talk about how do people vote. So I'll just write that. How do people vote? Okay, this is a one-issue election. So people are gonna vote for, so the voting rule, try that again. The voting rule is to vote for the party closest to your preferred tariff. Okay, so the parties are going to choose positions on tariffs, and then the voting rule is that people are going to vote for the party that has the closest position to their preferred tariff. Okay, and then I have to add one more little thing. What if both parties are exactly the same distance away from people's preferred somebody's preferred tariff? Then just vote randomly. So if parties are equally distant, votes randomly. Okay? So I'm going to redraw my little square here, or my little rectangle. T equals 0. Okay, so again, this models, or this illustrates the distribution of people's preferences across tariffs. It goes from 0 tariffs to 1 tariff, and people have this, and the same number of people in this population prefer each level of tariff. Okay, so let's think about the situation when, let's say, party 2 chooses this position. So party 1 needs to think about where they want to position themselves. Okay, so let's suppose that party 1 just positions themselves here. Okay. So based on our discussion, which I already did, everybody to the left of party 1 is going to vote for party 1, right? If my tariff preference is 0, it's closer to party 1, who has a relatively low policy suggestion or policy position. So I'm going to prefer party 1's tariff policy to party 2's tariff policy. Party 2 is suggesting a very high tariff. Okay, so if I'm to the left of party 1's political position, then I'm going to vote for party 1. So in fact, all these people in this area are going to vote for party 1. All right, what about the people in the middle between party 1 and party 2? Well, the people that are closer to party 1 are going to vote for party 1, and the people that are closer to party 2 are going to vote for party 2. And then there's one measure 0, just a very few number of people that are right on this line that are equally distant from party 1 to party 2. We don't really have to think about them because there's so few. It's just one little tiny point. But half of them exactly are going to vote for party 1, and half of them are going to vote for party 2. Okay, so let's write this out. Let's write this out mathematically. What share of votes is party 1 going to get, or how many votes is party 1 going to get? All right, so let's write votes to party 1. Okay, so it's going to be everybody to the left of P1. So that's P1, this distance. So it's going to be P1, the distance on the horizontal axis. I see you can't see me drawing anything. I'm pointing with my pointer at my pen. It doesn't do anything. But anyway, the distance, it's going to be the rectangle between t equals 0 and P1, and then the vertical line on the rectangle is 1. So basically it's going to be P1. Okay, so that's the rectangle to the left of P1. And then what about the rectangle to the right of P1, the votes that go to party 1? Right, so we have to add the distance between P2 and P1 times 1/2, right? So it's the whole rectangle, so I'll just say, you can see me drawing it. It's this whole rectangle times 1/2, right? So that's the distance between P2 and P1 times 1, and then half of that rectangle. Okay, so it looks like that equation that I wrote down here. So that's the votes that party 1 gets in this situation. Now, what I want you to do is think about what happens if party 1 decides to move their position just a little bit to the right. Okay, so they're gonna raise their policy position on tariffs. They're gonna advocate a tariff that's a little bit higher than the one that they're currently advocating. And and we're going to see if that increases the number of votes they get, decreases the number of votes they get, or keeps it the same. Okay, so we can do that by looking at the derivative of V1, that's the votes that party 1 gets, with respect to P1, right? We're moving P1 a little bit to the right. We're raising P1 a little tiny bit. How does that affect the votes that party 1 gets? Okay, so take the derivative of this expression. It's fairly straightforward. It's 1. And then you can see there's going to be a minus sign here in 1/2, minus 1/2, which is equal to 1/2, which is greater than 0. So when party 1 moves a little bit to the right, they actually increase their vote share. Okay, and note that this didn't depend on P2 at all. So this is going to be true anywhere to the left of P2. Okay, so party 1 basically is going to want to move all the way over there to where P2 is. Now, let's just think about why this is true. Just geometrically, we can see it right on the graph I drew. So if P1 moves a little bit to the right, it means that there's going to be more room on the left. Did I say P1? If P1 moves a little bit to the right, there's more, the rectangle on the left of P1 is actually a little bit bigger, right? This one gets a little bit bigger, and it grows by 1. You can see that like the height of this rectangle is 1, you get the whole thing. All right. On the right-hand side, this rectangle gets a little bit smaller, but you know, the party only gets half of the votes in that rectangle. It gets all of the votes in the rectangle on the left. So when the rectangle on the right of P1 gets smaller, P1, you know, intuitively party 1 loses only half of that area, whereas if the party on the left of P1 gets bigger, then party 1 gains all of the area, okay, in votes. So that's the intuition for why it's always better for party 1 to move to the right as long as they're to the left of party 2. Okay, so let's think about the situation. So P1 is going to move all the way over here to the right, all the way to where P2 is. That's going to increase its vote share. Okay, so let's look at that situation and think about whether that's an equilibrium. So be done with this one, and now we're going to draw a new representation of the distribution of tariff preferences. Equals 0, equals 1, and the height of this thing is 1. Okay, so again, we're going to have P2 over here. And then we're going to say that this is also P1. Okay, so P1 and P2 are actually at the same point. All right, so now we're in a very special situation. So we're going to ask, is this an equilibrium? Is this an equilibrium? All right, so remember that I had that special rule. The special rule about voting is if you're equal distance to the two parties, you vote randomly. Okay, so when P1 and P2 are at exactly the same tariff policy position, then actually party 1 is going to get exactly half of all the votes, and party 2 is going to get exactly half of all the votes. Okay, so my question, is that an equilibrium? Well, no, it can't be an equilibrium. And the reason why is because, let's see if I can get a good black color here. No, because if P1 moves a bit slower, party 1 gets more than half the votes. All right, so imagine that P1 here moves just marginally, just a tiny little bit to the left. Okay, you can see that this region here is greater than 1/2 of the votes. Oops, it's greater than 1/2 of the votes. So it means that if P1 moves just a tiny marginal bit to the left, party 1 is going to get more than half the votes. Okay, so it means that this can't possibly be an equilibrium because there's a profitable deviation. You know, if party 2 if party 2 and party 1 are at exactly the same policy position, party 1 has an incentive to move just a little bit to the left and then pick up more than half the votes. It gets half of it, stays where it is. It gets more than half of it, moves a bit to the left. So now we have these two opposing forces that make our lives a little bit difficult, right? We've shown here in this first panel that party 1 is always going to have the incentive to move towards party 2, until, as we show in this panel, unless they're exactly at the same spot. And if so, then party one actually wants to move a little bit to the left. Okay, so far it looks like we're going to be in trouble. There's no real equilibrium. But we can actually find one place for the two parties that is going to be in equilibrium. I'm just going to draw it carefully here so I can make sure I'm not blocking it with my face. Right. So now let's consider this situation. We're going to redraw this vote preference distribution. T equals 0 to t equals 1. Okay, now we're going to have a line right in the middle. So let's say this is right at 1/2 exactly. 1/2 is P1 and it's also P2. Okay. Now this is actually the only equilibrium. Okay, and why is that? It's because at this equilibrium, where each party is getting exactly half of the votes, if party one deviates, if party one moves just a little bit to the left, then party one is actually going to get like basically half the votes, but actually just a tiny shade less than half the votes. All right. If party one, say again, moves just a little bit to the right, then it's going to get just a shade under half the votes. And the same is true for party two. So each party has no incentive to deviate. Okay, so this is the equilibrium where they both choose exactly the policy position right in the middle. Okay, so let me move over here to the next slide. Median voter. I'll call it a theorem, why not? Okay, so it says, or I'll just say in our example, both parties choose the middle position in equilibrium. Okay, so we saw that in the example we just worked through, both parties, the only equilibrium for both parties was actually to choose exactly the middle position. Okay, so in a more general distribution, both parties choose the median, right? That doesn't have to be in the middle. So to give you an example, just to draw you a little picture, suppose that the distribution of voters look like, something like that. So here's the tariff policy preferences, here's tariff 0, here's tariffs equal to 1. Basically, both parties are going to try to find the place, I'm going to guess it's going to be like right around here, where there's exactly 1/2 of the mass to the right and 1/2 of the mass to the left, and that's going to be the policy position they're going to choose. So then it's going to be party 1 and party 2 here. And it's for the same reason, right? So each of them, when they have the same position and they're at the median voter, they each get half the votes. If they move a shade to the right, they get just a shade less than half the votes. If they move a shade to the left, they get just a shade less than half the votes. So the general theorem says that when you have two political parties, they're debating, they're trying to choose the policy position to maximize the votes on only one issue, then they're going to choose the median. Okay, so why are we talking about that? So let's talk about tariffs. Oops. I hit that big again. All right. So why are we talking about this? Let's talk about median voter and tariffs. Okay. Typically, can't see that. Median voter and do another line. And tariffs on a specific good. Something's gonna happen. All right. So suppose that we have like, suppose we have a factory that's making brooms, all right, for sweeping. And we're considering putting a tariff on brooms from China, okay, or brooms from abroad, right? So the idea would be that we're going to protect and then we're going to help the workers at that factory. But if we do that, it's going to make brooms expensive for everybody in the country. Okay, so if people are only looking after their own well-being, they might say, there's going to be maybe 100 people in Denmark working at the broom factory. Maybe there's going to be 5 million people in Denmark that are going to be using brooms. So even though this could be really important for those 100 people that work in the broom factory, the median person is going to be thinking about getting a cheaper broom. So the median voter is going to prefer not placing the tariff. Okay, so I'll say that median voter is harmed by the tariff. We would expect no tariffs. Okay. So that's one model of how political policies come to be. Right. Now let me tell you a second model. And this one, there's not a picture or a math formula, but it deals with an economics concept called a public good. Okay. So let's talk about collective action. Okay. So let's think about that broom example. Okay, so suppose we have politicians and they're thinking about whether to place this tariff on brooms. All right, so many people gain a bit, I should say lose a bit from the tariff. A bit from the tariff. Okay. But political action is a public good. Okay, so what does that mean? Political action, I'll just put it in parentheses here, writing to a politician. Okay, so suppose that I know that people are debating this tariff in the parliament, and I'm thinking, I would really like to write to the parliamentarian that I vote for, and tell them that I would prefer to have no tariff because I might want to buy a broom, and the brooms will be more expensive if there's a tariff on brooms. The thing is, basically the people that gain, like everybody gains from me writing that letter a little bit, but I'm the one that's bearing the cost, right? I have to think about it, I have to formulate the letter, I have to send it into the Americanism, congressman. I have to send it into the parliamentarian, and that takes me some time and some effort, and really the gains aren't that big, but so maybe I just don't do it. So the idea is many people get a small gain, but the person who writes the letter bears a larger cost. Okay, so the gain added up across everybody, it's definitely worth the cost. But the problem is that I'm the one that bears the cost, and I'm not the one that gets the gain. Like I only get a small gain. It's only when you add it up that it gets big. Okay, so I'm just gonna write cost larger than personal gain. And I'll write cost smaller than collective gain. Okay, so my personal cost is bigger than my personal gain, but my personal cost is smaller than the collective gain. Okay, so this is a classic public good problem. I'm just going to write classic public good. Classic public good. Okay, so that's on the side of brooms. Maybe I should write up here brooms. These are the people who want no tariff. Okay, I'll just write over here, Broom's tariff. So these are like the factory workers in the broom factory. Okay, so these guys, the cost of political action, I'm gonna write that. Maybe let me write one other sentence first. So I'm gonna write gains from tariff to each worker are quite large. Right? So at the broom factory, if there's a tariff, that means more work, they're not going to lose their jobs. The gains are quite large. Okay, so here, the cost, the personal cost, maybe I should write that, personal cost is smaller than personal gain. Okay, so here we've sort of solved the public good problem, because there's no public good problem, because the personal cost for the worker who's going to write the letter or attend the protest to support the tariff is going to be smaller than the personal gain, because the personal gain is really big. Okay, so so at the end of the day, we can actually come to a conclusion. So conclusion: trade policy seems to be driven by collective action rather than the median voter. Okay, so if we have to compare these two, we know that in the real world, as I showed you guys last time in class, there's still very large agricultural subsidies, there's still tariffs on various types of goods. So trade policy, tariffs and subsidies seem to be driven more by collective action than by median voter. Because the median voter, if they were selfish, they would vote against subsidies and against tariffs, and yet in the real world we do see subsidies and tariffs. Okay, so likely the collective action model here is a better description of reality when we're thinking about tariffs and subsidies. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have to say for number one. Now remember, we have three things to talk about. So number two here is trade wars. Okay, so let me quick write that. Trade wars. Okay, and here we're going to use a normal form game. I don't know if you guys have seen simple game theory, like an introduction to game theory. You probably have. They typically cover that in a micro course. So let's consider two countries. Let's call them the EU. It's not a country, but they have a common trade policy. Let's call it the EU, and let's let the other country be the United States. Okay, so we've got the EU and the United States. I'm going to shift them around a little bit here. I kind of screwed up the thing. Let me draw the payoffs first, and then I'll draw the countries on after. Okay, 10-10 here. And then here, let's draw. This should be 10. Oh no, it should be a negative. Let's do negative 10. 11. Here we'll do 11, negative 10, and then here we'll do negative 5, negative 5. All right, we'll have this one up here be the EU. We'll have this one over here be the US. Okay, and then this is no tariff, let's say, no T. And then down here we'll have tariff. Okay, and then over here we'll have no tariff and tariff. Okay, so to remind you how to read one of these normal form games, in the parentheses here, the first number refers to the payoff to the United States, and the second number is going to refer to the payoff to the EU. So to give you an example, if if the United States chooses no tariff and the EU chooses no tariff, then each country gets a payoff of 10, or each region, if you like, the EU, gets a payoff of 10, right? So the United States gets 10 and the EU gets 10. So that's kind of the best possibility for everybody in this, well, not for everybody, you'll see. Okay, next let's suppose that the US chooses no tariff and the EU chooses tariff. Okay, so then we're in this region, this top left corner. That means that the United States is going to get -10, all right, and the EU is going to get 11. So one of the things that I very briefly mentioned last time is that each country actually has an optimal tariff. So if you, whatever country you are, no matter how small or how big you are, you can actually increase welfare by increasing your tariff just a tiny bit, at least a tiny bit. Okay, so here we see an example. If the EU assesses a tariff on the United States, that's really bad for the United States, but it actually is a little bit better for the EU than even the situation with 10. All right. Then if the United States, or I should say, if the EU chooses no tariff and the United States chooses tariff, then the United States gets 11 and the EU gets -10. And then finally, if both countries choose tariff, or both regions, EU and the United States choose tariff, then they both get -5. Okay. So clearly, the situation that's kind of the best for the world, if we add up the numbers together, is to do no tariff, right? Free trade, that would be the best. But let's figure out what would actually happen in a non-cooperative game. Okay, so let's think about the perspective of the EU first, say. Okay, so the EU is getting, remember, the second number in the parentheses. Okay, so if the United States chooses no tariff, then I'm going to circle over here with a different color. Let's make EU should be blue, I guess. So if the United States chooses no tariff, then what's best for the EU? They're comparing 10 or 11. They're going to choose. Ooh, I thought that I chose blue. They're choosing 10 or 11. They're going to choose 11. Okay. Then if the United States chooses tariff, the EU has a worse choice to choose from, but they can either get -10 or they can get -5. Well, they would choose -5. Okay. So sometimes this is called a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what the United States does. The best response of the EU is always to choose tariff. So the EU is always going to choose tariff. Now let's check out the United States. Right? So if the EU chooses no tariff, then the United States can choose between 10 and 11. They're going to choose 11. If the EU chooses tariff, then the United States is choosing between -10 and -5. They're going to choose -5. Okay. So what do we learn? We learn that this is the only Nash equilibrium in this game. So I'll write that out. The only Nash equilibrium is tariff. So I'll say this, this is a trade war. Okay, so this is a really big problem, and this kind of describes the situation in, like, say, the 1930s, when all over the world, all the countries in the developed world at the time, I guess it wasn't as developed as it is today, but say European countries all started putting big tariffs on each other in the 1930s. All right, so you had a trade war. These days, sometimes people say that China and the United States are engaging in a trade war. They're putting big tariffs on products from the other country. Right. So, this is bad, right? We look at the result here and we see that everybody in the world is getting -5 when they could be getting 10, right? Why? I mean, we'd really like to move to 10. We want to move to free trade, but it's really hard to do because there's no sort of overarching government that can enforce free trade on everyone, okay? So what ended up happening is after World War II, I'll just say solution, and I'll say there was an organization formed called GATT. So that's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, maybe, something like that. But it later changed its name to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So it solves this problem by making sort of a supranational body. Okay, so the WTO, in a sense, I mean, of course, it was agreed to by all the governments of the world, but basically it's a body that sits on top of the governments of the world. Okay, so it's a supranational organization. All right. And the way it works is it comes up with a punishment. All right. So if a country does tariff on another country, all countries in WTO can punish offender with tariffs. Okay, so if somebody's not playing by the rules of the WTO, which is basically free trade, if a member of the WTO does that, then all the other members are now allowed to punish the offending member, and that sort of that provides a pretty strong incentive for countries to live up to their promises. All right, so this is a really interesting solution. The hard part is getting countries to sign up for it, right? But if you sign up, it's kind of like golden handcuffs, because then you get basically, very, very low tariffs with all the other members of WTO. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about it, but this is actually often a suggestion that people bring up with climate change. So they say that we could make a supranational body called a climate club, and if you're part of the climate club, then you get really low tariffs with everybody. But if you break the rules, if you're polluting even within your own country, then now the climate club is going to raise the tariffs on you. All right, so I'm going to say Nordhaus because it's Bill Nordhaus is the I guess most famous proponent of a climate club. Nordhaus's climate club works on a similar principle. Okay, so that was trade wars. And now the very last thing I want to talk about is trade creation and trade diversion. Trade creation versus trade diversion. Okay. So we've talked about how having lower tariffs tends to increase efficiency, right? I mean, if you have a world with very, very low tariffs all over, that's good for everybody. Subject to the caveats that we've talked about earlier. So now the question I want to ask is it always good to do a regional trade agreement or just a trade agreement among just a small number of countries to reduce tariffs between them? Okay, so the question is, I'll write this out now. So subject to caveats, free trade is best. Is it also always beneficial to make regional trade agreements? The answer is no. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little example. Okay, so suppose we have three countries. We'll call them the United States, Denmark, and France. Okay, so let's suppose that these three countries are producing wheat. Okay, and suppose U.S. produces wheat. U.S. can produce wheat at say 3 euros per bushel. Okay. Suppose France can produce wheat. Actually, I think I'm going to do $4 per bushel for the United States. I'm trying to make this example work just right. Suppose France is going to make wheat at 6 euros per bushel. So this is the cost of production. And then suppose that Denmark wheat is 8 euros per bushel. Okay, so Denmark is the least efficient at making wheat of these 3 countries. You can't see it because my face is there. What's the right way to do this? I wish there was a way I could copy it. Let me just do this. US wheat is going to be, I'm just going to rewrite what I have behind my face there. 4 euros per bushel. And France is going to be 6 euros per bushel. All right, so anyway, Denmark is the worst at making wheat, France is the second best, and US is the best. Okay, so let's consider 2 situations. First, let's consider a situation where Denmark has a tariff of 5 euros against both France and the United States. So I'm going to say situation 1. I'll call it the 5 euro tariff. Okay. So if Denmark buys from US, the Danish taxpayer is going to pay 9 euros per bushel, of course. Buy from France, the Danish taxpayer is going to pay 11 euros. Buy from Denmark, the Danish taxpayer pays 8 euros, right? Because there's no tariff, of course, on domestically produced wheat. Okay. So in this case, the Danish taxpayer wants to buy from Denmark. Okay. So we now are in the 5 euro tariff situation. So let's move to a regional trade agreement with France. Call it the France agreement. Okay, so now the idea is that Denmark's still going to charge, US is outside, Denmark is still charging a tariff on US wheat, but now they're not going to charge a tariff on French wheat. Okay, so now let's look at the prices. I'll just maybe circle this one with red, this one down here. All right, so now I'm writing with red again. Okay, here we go. Okay, so now if they buy from the US, still 9 euros. Buy from France, now it's going to be 6 euros. Buy from Denmark, it's going to be 8 euros. Okay, so in this situation, actually, Denmark wants to buy from France. Okay, and this is good, right? So I'm going to just write down here. They're gonna, if they implement this trade agreement. So I'm going to just say France agreements leads to saving 2 euros, right? So that's good. That's good for Denmark. They get their wheat cheaper. Now let's consider situation 2. Okay. So here, let's suppose we have a tariff of 3 euros. Very similar, right? We had 5 euros before, now we have 3 euros. Okay. So if we buy from the US, if Denmark buys from the US, they're gonna have to pay 4 plus 3, 7 euros. They buy from France, they have to pay 9 euros. And if they buy from Denmark, well, they don't have to pay a tariff then, so they get 8 euros. Right, so in this case, Denmark wants to buy from the United States. All right, now we're going to do our regional trade agreement. It's still going to be with France, so we'll call it the French agreement. Oops. So French agreements. Okay, so we're still going to charge tariffs on the United States. We're not going to charge tariffs on France. Okay, so if we buy US, we get we still have to pay 7 euros. If we buy from France, then we have to pay now we get it for 6 euros. And then buy DK, 8 euros. Okay. So now consumers in Denmark get to buy from France and they get 6 euros. Okay, so this looks good, right? They saved 1 euro, right? But in this case, beforehand, when they were buying from the United States, 4 euros of that was being paid to the United States, but 3 euros of it was tariff revenue. Okay, so the actual price being paid by Danes in situation 2, beforehand, I'm going to write actual price here. Price was 7 euros minus the 3 euro tariff. That's government revenue, right? Equals 4 euros. And the actual price here is 6 euros. Okay? So actually, this is bad. The French agreement leads to more expensive wheat. All right? So that's what happened, okay? So, I mean, you made a regional trade agreement, you reduced tariffs. The only thing that happened was there were high tariffs, you reduced them, and then now your country is actually worse off, okay? So, what happened here? Okay, so this is one of these interesting things where there's this theorem in economics called the theory of the second best. And what that says is that the best thing you can have is just, or the most efficient thing you can have is just totally free trade. Okay, but once you don't have free trade, then getting closer to free trade doesn't necessarily make you better off. Okay, so the idea is that once you're at the second best, it might actually be better for you to be far away from the first best rather than just marginally close to the first best. You're actually better off. So how does that work here? Well, what happened was basically this tariff of 3, it was doing a good job with France because it was telling Danish consumers that they shouldn't really buy from France. That's not the best place to buy from. And once we took that tariff away, then suddenly France looked more attractive. Okay, so the consumers buy from France, but that's actually worse because the government isn't collecting the tariff revenue. Okay, so how can we tell? Whether regional trade agreements is a good idea. Okay, so how can we tell? If it creates trade, then do it. If it diverts trade, don't. Okay, so let's think about our two situations. In the first situation, Denmark was not trading, they were just buying from themselves. Okay, when we reduce tariffs, then they're going to buy from somebody who's more efficient than them, and there's no tariff revenue, so we don't have to worry about that. All right, so if trade is being created, that's actually a good thing. That's a good, that regional trade agreement is going to make people better off. I can see that I covered up this thing with my face here. Let me just move it, since I'm not going to write anything else, I don't think. Let's see if I can do this. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. How's that? So like I was saying, if you're going to create trade, then things are going to be good for you. That's going to be good. Do that regional trade agreement. However, if when you implement the trade agreement, if it's just going to move the trade from one place to another place, that's going to be bad for you. So in our example, in situation 2, we just moved the trade from the United States to France. That's actually going to be bad. All right. So there's some discussion about in the real world. There's a kind of a famous trade agreement from the 1990s in North America called NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, right? NAFTA. And there's been quite a bit of research, and some of it finds that actually for Mexico, the agreement actually was not good. It actually reduced welfare. And the reason why is because of trade diversion. So Mexico, say, was importing from China in the 1990s when it had both tariffs on China and the United States. But then once they entered into the free trade agreement, they reduced their tariffs with the United States. They kept tariffs on China, like low-cost producers abroad. And then now they're importing from the United States. But often the United States was actually a higher cost producer than the low-cost producers abroad that Mexico used to be importing from. So this trade creation, trade diversion can actually be quite an important thing in the real world. Okay, so those are the three things that I want to discuss. So there you go.